Well, good morning, everybody, or good evening, whenever you're actually watching the video. Assuming you've already watched the first endocrine video, and we had just finished up talking about all the different hormones produced by the anterior pituitary or the adrenal hypophysis. Right? Remember, the anterior pituitary produced and secreted a number of different hormones, from growth hormone to FSH to LH. TSH, there was a number of different hormones that it produced and secreted. We had just finished up the last video talking about those different functions. Now we're going to shift and start to talk about a couple of the hormones which are released by the posterior pituitary. Now remember, you'll recall that the posterior pituitary can also be called something, or is also called the neurohypophysis. So posterior pituitary, neurohypophysis, they are the same thing. All right, but one of the hormones that is released by the posterior pituitary is anti-diuretic hormone, or ADH. Right, we talked about aldosterone. Aldosterone was something that was released from the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal glands, and that was released in response to ACTH being released from the pituitary gland. Now, anti-diuretic hormone, the end result is the same. The function is the same. It's meant to retain volume, retain fluid. However, how it gets there is very different, right? Anti-diuretic hormone is produced in the hypothalamus, right? It's produced in the hypothalamus, but yet the posterior pituitary stores and then secretes that particular hormone, right? So whereas in the anterior pituitary actually produced and then secreted the hormone. In the neurohypophysis, or the posterior pituitary, the two hormones being anti-diuretic hormone and oxytocin, they're actually produced in the hypothalamus, then they're stored in the neurohypophysis and released from there. So when we continue talking about anti-diuretic hormone, right? Anti-diuretic hormone, okay, so diuretics cause you to get rid of fluid, right, through the urine. Anti-diuretic is going to cause you to retain that fluid. And you can see it's highly sensitive, right? Highly sensitive to osmolality changes, right? Less than a 1% change can cause anti-diuretic hormone to be released. Osmolality, right? That, think of like concentration, the number of particles in a particular solution, or in the blood. Right? Think of it, if you made lemonade, for instance, right? If you put 1% less sugar in the lemonade, or 1% less lemon juice in the lemonade, you wouldn't notice a lick of difference. You wouldn't notice any appreciable difference in the taste. However, that's how sensitive our body is, and that's how little of a change has to occur in the blood in order for our hypothalamus to stimulate the release of anti-diuretic hormone. Now, as far as the sensitivity to volume changes, it's still relatively sensitive, right? Nowhere near as sensitive as the changes brought about by concentration differences or osmolality differences in the blood. But it takes around a 10 or so % chance, or a change in blood volume, in order for anti-diuretic hormone to be released from the posterior pituitary. Now, whereas in the aldosterone, which we talked about in the being released from the zona glomerulosa of the adrenal gland, right? Its function was on the nephron, specifically a part of the tubule. Here next week or the week thereafter, two weeks from now, when we start to talk about urinary system, we'll get into the exact location of where in the nephron that takes place. Something called the collecting duct, that's where anti-diuretic hormone has its impact, right? So we can see kind of on the graph here, these osmoreceptors, right? Remember, there was a number of different receptors in the body that we've talked about. In cardiovascular system from last semester, right, there are these baroreceptors, these stretch receptors. They allowed the body to kind of determine what our blood pressure was. If blood pressure was too low, these baroreceptors didn't stretch enough, so one of the responses was to elevate cardiac rate, constrict some blood vessels, to elevate blood pressure. Osmoreceptors, kind of the same idea in the sense that these receptors, we can see high blood osmotic. Here we go. High blood osmotic pressure stimulates hypothalamic osmoreceptors. So essentially, the pressure produced by the molecules inside of the blood. There's tiny little receptors which can detect those particular changes. Right, so if those changes stimulate the release of, or if they stimulate the hypothalamus, that's what's going to then actually stimulate the release of anti-diuretic hormone. And you can see some of the things that occur. Right, the kidneys begin to retain more water. Right, if we want to elevate blood pressure, well, if we increase blood volume, we cause the kidneys to retain more water and produce less urine. So if we produce less urine, we have more available fluid inside of the body. Secondly, we produce less sweat. Right, one of the things about sweat is probably 99+% water. Not probably, it is. That it's the 99+% water. So if we are running low on water, or if we're becoming deficient or dehydrated, our body will begin to produce less sweat. We want to retain that fluid. The next thing that will happen is arterioles will begin to constrict. Right, all these things we talked about in the release of aldosterone. So again, the impact is the same. However, how we got there is quite a bit different. There we go. The next hormone we're going to look at, something called oxytocin. Right, we see oxytocin, just like the anti-diuretic hormone, that is also released from the posterior pituitary or the neural hypophysis. Right, functions-wise of oxytocin, we see it stimulates uterine contractions as well as stimulates milk ejection from the mammary glands. Right, so think of kind of oxytocin being the ejector. Right, it ejects the milk from the mammary glands and it ejects junior from the womb. Right, if the uterus contracts, right, that is what we talk about. Oh my gosh, I'm going into labor. I'm having contractions. Yeah, specifically what they're talking about is the contraction of the myometrium, or the uterus, or the muscle in the wall of the uterus. Now, if you'll recall from last video, right, there was something called the hypophyseal portal tract. That was essentially the capillary system, which the hypothalamus secreted into, right? The hypothalamus secreted into the capillary bed. The venous tract carries those hormones, and the next stop, right, the next gland that particular capillary bed comes into contact with is the pituitary. So those hormones are carried to the pituitaries, and then those hormones come into contact with the receptors in the pituitary gland, specifically the anterior pituitary. The neural hypophysis is a bit different, right? There's still a tract system which allows for the hormones to be released. However, it's entirely neuronally based, or kind of based upon nervous system or little neurons. And you see the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Don't ask me who named it. It's absurd, but hey, that's what it is. But you can see that's the connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. Right, these are actual neurons. This is actual nervous tissue. In the actual neurons themselves, the endoplasmic reticulum, if you jump way back to chapter 3, right, when we talk about the production of different hormones, or the production of different proteins, right, they're produced within the cell body. If you recall those endoplasmic reticulum, right, the Golgi apparatus, right, those organelles that we talked about, this is where those hormones are produced, and then they travel along the axon, and they're stored in that synaptic end bulb, right? We see way down here the axon terminal, kind of the very end of the axon, right? This little kind of bulbous thing here. That's where that hormone is stored. Right, now, when I say travels down the axon, do not get that confused with depolarization. That is something entirely different. Right? Entirely different. Right? So don't get them confused. So we've spent a great deal of time on the hypothalamus, on the pituitary, and for good reason, right? The pituitary releases a huge number of hormones, and really it can impact any number of bodily functions. But there are a number of glands outside of the pituitary which do have a significant, right, endocrine function. One of the glands that we see, right, the parathyroid gland, para around thyroid gland, right, the parathyroid gland. This is kind of a posterior view, right? If you look at somebody from the front, from the anterior, right, you'll kind of recall where the thyroid gland is. If I were to, pull out the thyroid, spin it around, on the back side of it, right, there's kind of four little masses. And those masses, those four collectively, are what make up the parathyroid gland. Now, as far as what the parathyroid gland as far as what it does, right? The parathyroid gland releases something called parathyroid hormone or parathormone. I should say parathormone, not parthormone. Parthormone. I apologize. There should be an A in there. But we see parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium levels. All right. This isn't the first time we mentioned hormones and their ability to impact blood calcium levels. When we looked at the thyroid gland in the previous video, the thyroid gland produced something called calcitonin. Calcitonin, if you remember that stupid little saying, calcitonin puts calcium back in the bone, right? So if calcitonin released from the thyroid gland causes calcium to be put into the bone, how does that impact blood calcium levels? Well, how does that impact blood calcium levels? Well, if I take the calcium and put it into the bone, that means I have to take it out of the blood. So calcitonin causes blood calcium levels to lower. Parathyroid hormone does the exact opposite, right? Parathyroid hormone actually increases blood calcium levels, right? It increases blood calcium levels. So how does that impact bone formation? Well, it reduces bone formation, right? Think about it. If it takes calcium to produce bone, well, the calcium, by and large, comes from the blood. So if we produce bone, that means blood calcium levels are going to lower, which we don't want that if parathyroid hormone is released. Parathyroid hormone wants to elevate blood calcium levels. So when that happens, we begin to slow the production of bone. Secondly, right, parathyroid hormone can actually increase the reabsorption of bone, which means we actually start to break bone down, right? And that's okay. That is a ongoing process, right? Don't think, oh my gosh, this is something that's going to cause osteoporosis, right? Sure, if somebody has like a parathyroid tumor or has like hypersecretion of parathyroid hormone, sure, you can start to have significantly elevated breakdown of bone, right? But that's not that's not like the etiology of osteoporosis. That's something, the etiology of osteoporosis is very different. I talked about it last semester in 121. Involving with the parathyroid hormone, right? As I mentioned, as it can reduce or it can increase the resorption of bone. Right? Because think of it, our skeleton is just a gigantic pool of calcium, right? There's a reason why calcium was kind of the mineral of choice, right? There's a huge number of functions that calcium is involved with, from neuron function to muscle function, and there is a huge, right, in the regulation of a number of different metabolic processes. Calcium is very important, so it's kind of no surprise that there's this gigantic pool of it in the skeleton. Something else that is released from the parathyroid the parathyroid gland, is something called calcitriol, right? Calcitriol is something that's going to be released from the kidney, right? Parathyroid hormone stimulates the release of calcitriol from the kidney. And what happens is a couple of things, right? When calcitriol is present, that actually stimulates the increased absorption of calcium from the diet, right? So the food that we ate, assuming we ate some sort of food that had some degree of nutrition, Right, some food that exists out there, highly questionable if it actually even has any nutrients in it, but I digress. If the food we had has calcium in it, right, the presence of calcitriol literally increases how much of that calcium we actually absorb. Right. The other thing that calcitriol can do, right, is excuse me. Sorry about that. I had to pause the video for a second. I forgot how to actually swallow coffee there for a minute, which is not shocking. Anyways, talking about calcitriol and its release from the kidney. How I just mentioned how one of the things that calcitriol does is stimulates the absorption of calcium from the intestines, or it increases the amount that's absorbed. One of the other things that calcitriol actually does is it allows the body to retain more calcium, right? We don't lose as much calcium through the urine in the presence of calcitriol, right? In the urinary system, in about 3 or so weeks when we cover that, that's one of the ways that our body is able to regulate different ions in the body, whether it's sodium levels, calcium levels, magnesium, potassium, etc. One of the ways that your body gets rid of excess molecules or excess ions is through the urine. So if we have parathyroid hormone secretion, that means blood calcium levels are low. So we want to retain as much calcium as possible. So one of the things we do, or one of the things that our body does, is we reduce how much calcium we're actually losing through the urine. Well, there we go. This next hormone we're going to get into, right? When we think about the pancreas, everybody has talked about the pancreas, or I'm sure you've heard about the pancreas, or if you've known somebody who's had type 2 diabetes, or somebody who is a diabetic, there is some sort of issue with the pancreas, right? So there's a cell in the pancreas called the beta cell, right? That is the cell which is going to produce the insulin. Now, as far as where it's located, right? If you kind of think about if you kind of go to your rib cage and go just beneath it, kind of right, almost like in the middle of the torso, right? That's right where the pancreas is. And you can see, to the left, well, viewing it to the right, but as far as on as far as on you, the spleen would be to the left, right? The abdominal aorta, right? We talked about that last semester in 121. The common hepatic artery, the celiac trunk, right in that region is where the pancreas lies, right? And in lab, you'll talk kind of more about the position of the pancreas. So one of the things to keep in mind is that the pancreas plays a kind of a dual role. It has a huge role in digestion, as well as a role in regulating endocrine function. The digestive enzymes, right? We are going to cover that in digestion. So amylase, lipase, and something called trypsin. Those are all digestive enzymes. All right, and we will talk about those during digestion. When we look at the endocrine hormones, or kind of the endocrine part of the pancreas, right? These little tiny structures within the pancreas called the islets of Langerhans, or the pancreatic islets. Same thing, doesn't matter, right? But really, there's really mainly four hormones which are released from the pancreas. Insulin, right? Insulin is a very important hormone. We've have talked about insulin before. Really, in the next couple of slides, we're going to break out what the functions of these individual hormones are. But a couple of things is that insulin and glucagon, right? They are antagonistic to one another, meaning they oppose one another. Their function opposes each other. All right, so that's actually the next thing we're going to get into. As I'm just going to jump to this slide here. No, you do not have to remember every single step of this particular graph. This is just kind of to pinpoint. This is just to kind of show you the number of effects that insulin has. Right, insulin is released in the presence of, or kind of in the in the presence of elevated blood glucose levels. Right, so you eat a meal, whatever it happens to be, there's going to be some degree of insulin release. Now, depending on the glycemic index of that particular meal, meaning how much does that food impact your blood sugar levels, that's going to dictate how much insulin is elevated. So if you have, if you eat whatever thing of slice of white bread, which is, has a very high glycemic index, which means it elevates your blood sugar a pretty significant amount, you're going to have a greater degree of insulin being released. If you eat something like a hunk of cheese or I was going to say a stick of butter. I don't really know who's walking around eating sticks of butter, but hey, I saw at a state fair once they're actually deep frying sticks of butter. If you've had one, please tell me they're delicious because I would love to try one. But anyways, right, something like butter or cheese, right, pepperoni, bologna, right, things that are kind of high in fat and protein and really have next to no carbohydrates. They minimally elevate. They still elevate blood glucose levels, sure, but much, much less so than a slice of bread or a slice of white bread or white rice or white pasta, those sorts of things. Again, I'm not knocking white rice and knocking white pasta. Well, I guess I kind of am a little bit. But one of the things about we talk about avoiding simple carbs and those sorts of things, right? A lot of foods, right? White bread, pastas, and things like that. Years ago, back in like the 20s, and before refrigeration was available, there were huge crops of, huge stockpiles of, wheat and corn and things and barley and rye. They were just going rancid after a couple of days, right? Because refrigeration wasn't widely available. I don't know who it was. They figured out that if they removed the germ from the wheat crop, that that crop, when stockpiled, would last weeks on end before going rancid. So they just simply started to remove the germ, the wheat germ. The problem with that is all of the fiber content, a huge amount of the nutritional content of that particular wheat crop lived in the wheat germ. So when the wheat germ was removed, the bulk of fiber was removed along with it. I say the bulk, I mean, I'm talking the vast majority of the fiber was removed along with it. And that's kind of the big downfall when we talk about, eating simple carbohydrates, right? White bread, white pasta, white rice, sugar, those sorts of things, is that their fiber content has been pretty much almost entirely removed. And the kicker is that it's the fiber which is responsible for dampening the spike in the insulin, right? Right now, I hate to make, we talk about kind of flattening the curve again. The severity, where the parallel, I'm by no means talking about how this lecture corresponds to COVID-19 and the pandemic and all that kind of thing, but talking about kind of flattening the curve, right, in the sense that instead of having this huge spike, right, it's more flattened and drawn out, right? That's what fiber does when it comes to blood sugar levels, right? If you eat a thing of whatever, a slice of white bread, white pasta, white rice, there's a very quick spike in blood sugar levels. So there's a very quick spike in insulin levels. If it's whole grain bread, whole grain pasta, brown rice, that the fiber content still remains in that food. So therefore the blood sugar or the glucose is absorbed much more slowly through the intestines, which means blood sugar levels rise much more slowly. Therefore, insulin levels rise that much more slowly, right? Since the blood sugar levels, rise more slowly when you consume a high fiber diet, it's much, much easier for the body to control that sort of release. So, right at a given time, there's somewhere between 5 and 10 grams of glucose in the blood. Again, that ballpark, right? There's a range. On average, it's 8 to 10, right around 8. So the range is 5 to 10. Average person is 8. So really, it doesn't sound like very much. It's like the weight of 2 nickels. So when we eat food, right, we absorb a huge amount of nutrients. We absorb a huge amount of carbohydrates, we absorb a huge amount of fats, protein, whatever it happens to be. When that happens, our blood glucose levels are going to elevate. And if we don't need that additional blood glucose for energy and ATP production, we've got to do something. We've got to store it somehow. And there's a couple different ways that we're going to be able to store it. One is as glycogen. Right? Glycogen is a very efficient, a very safe storage form of glucose. Right? Glycogen can be stored in skeletal muscle. Glycogen can be stored in the liver. Glycogen can be stored a little bit in the kidneys. Right? And the one thing about insulin, how it's actually can impact and cause your skeletal muscle to store blood glucose, that's the thing with insulin, right? Skeletal muscles have a receptor for insulin. Because remember, if a particular cell doesn't have a receptor for said hormone, that hormone doesn't impact that particular cell. So skeletal muscle cells have a receptor for insulin. So when insulin is released in the body, that's going to stimulate those skeletal muscle cells to begin to absorb that glucose and convert it into something called glycogen. Right? Does insulin always have to be present for skeletal muscle to uptake glucose? No. If we're exercising, right? That's one of the ways that we can kind of bypass the need for insulin. When we're exercising, there's epinephrine release. Epinephrine is one of those hormones which can kind of oversee or supersede a number of different physiologic effects. So when we're exercising, right, there doesn't need to be insulin present in order for that, quote unquote, that door to be opened for glucose. Right? When we're exercising, glucose can freely enter into the skeletal muscle, and the skeletal muscle can burn and utilize that glucose. Right? This is why, for instance, it's so important for type 2 diabetics, right? That kind of insulin resistance, diabetics. That's why it's so important. Yes, absolutely, it's important for them to change their diet, that sort of thing, but even for them to exercise, because they are insulin resistant, which means their body's receptors, their body cells are resisting, they're ignoring the insulin. Well, if they exercise, their skeletal muscles don't care about the insulin. They don't need the insulin in order for that door to be open, and glucose can freely enter into the skeletal muscle cell. The one thing about the liver, right? The liver, the hepatocytes, the liver cells, they actually don't have a receptor for insulin. Now you might think, well, if they don't have a receptor for insulin, they don't respond to the insulin. And you're correct, they don't respond to insulin. However, your hepatocytes, they can, at will, they can freely store insulin. Let's try that one again. They can freely store glucose and convert it into glycogen. Your liver is, and I mentioned this last in the previous recording. One of the functions of your liver is to adjust the composition of the blood. Food that you eat, it doesn't matter what it is, white rice, bread, cheese, cheeseburger, French fries. Once that's absorbed, right, 90% of what you eat, right, of what's actually absorbed into the bloodstream, the first organ that it goes to, before it goes to the heart, before it goes to the brain, before it goes to the kidneys, before it goes to anywhere else, the first organ that it goes to is to the liver. And the reason why is your liver adjusts the composition of that blood. So if your blood glucose levels are too elevated, if we just absorbed a huge amount of glucose in the blood, one of the things your liver can do is it can start to store that glucose in the form of glycogen. Same thing with, oh man, I'm trying to put on some muscle. I just ate 100 grams of protein, right? Elevated levels of protein are just as detrimental to the body as elevated levels of glucose, probably even more so. Right? Protein can cause a huge number, it's very impactful when it comes to fluid regulation in the body. When we talk about the urinary system in a couple of weeks, we'll talk about edema and swelling and how that entirely has to do with your body's inability to regulate where the proteins exist in the fluid in the body. So those are really the two big places where insulin can cause the storage of glycogen. And I got to mention a little bit in the kidneys as well. The other thing, right? The third place that glucose can be stored in a significant amount is in adipose tissue or fat tissue, right? So you can see the glucose in and of itself, you can see is converted into, you see on the slide, whether it's up here, right, or whether it's down here, these triacylglycerols, that's just a fancy term. That's another term for triglyceride, right? So when we have elevated levels of glucose, the other storage form that it takes is in the form of adipose tissue. Right, now this is problematic, right? Adipose tissue, there's a number of things which, obesity, having increased adiposity, as far as risk to diabetes, heart disease, stroke, there's a number of different things that obesity and adipose tissue are related to. So when we talk about the actual kind of terminology here for a second, so the things about insulin is going to stimulate lipogenesis or lipogenesis. I prefer lipogenesis, right? Lipid, genesis, generation. So it stimulates the generation of fat tissue. All right. The other thing insulin is going to do, it's going to stimulate glucogenesis. Glycogenesis, excuse me, right? Glycogenesis, the glycogen genesis, generation, so the actual generation of glycogen. Remember that glycogen, that's what's stored in the liver as well as the skeletal muscle, right? In mammals and in animals such as you and I, right? Glycogen is the storage form of glucose, right? One of the storage forms of glucose. When we talk about certain vegetables like white potatoes, people always talk about, oh, you can't eat French fries, are so starchy and whatnot. In plants, right, when plants store glucose, it's called starch. So it kind of makes sense that, oh yeah, those foods that are higher in starch have a higher caloric content to them. They have a higher energy content to them, and it makes sense, right? We just learned that, well, glucose is what's formed into energy. If we have elevated levels of glucose in the blood, we have to store it as glycogen. So therefore, it's a stored form of energy. That exact same process occurs in plants. However, that stored glucose isn't referred to as glycogen, it's referred to as starch. So therefore, you eat a starchy vegetable like French fries, right? Like a bag of Five Guys French fries, because, but the grease just kind of saturates into the bag. Oh, I could go for those right now. Anyways, when the starch, or when that glucose stores into the vegetable, right, that's what kind of it converts into, again, the starch. So that's why people talk about starchy vegetables can have a propensity to increase weight and those sorts of things. And I mean, it's not so much that it's specifically those particular vegetables, it's just the fact the sheer amount of them we consume. Like Five Guys I just mentioned, the fact that who the hell actually needs an entire bag of French fries? So anyways, so from here, from insulin, right, we're going to kind of shift and move on to something called glucagon. Now, glucagon, this is a hormone which kind of opposes, it opposes insulin, right? Whereas insulin helped to, stimulate glycogen, right? Something called glycogenesis, right? It helped to stimulate the production of lipids or fat adipose tissue through something called lipogenesis, right? Glucagon is going to do the opposite, right? Insulin wanted to reduce blood glucose levels, so it wanted to store blood glucose. Glucagon does the opposite, right? Glucagon wants to elevate blood glucose levels. So you can see these different, right, terms, whereas, right, glycolysis, right? Glycolysis is one of the first steps in the basically production of ATP, one of the first steps in the production of that energy currency of the cell. Again, in digestion and metabolism, we're going to talk all about glycolysis and oxidative phosphorylation. And down here at the bottom, this TCA cycle, we're going to talk all about this stuff. But glucagon is one of those hormones, so is insulin, but glucagon is one of those hormones which can impact the rate in which these things actually take place. By things, I mean glycolysis and the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle. Because one of the things that glucagon will do in the production of ATP, right, there's really kind of 4 steps when we talk about the production of ATP. The third step is something called the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle, and that's where we have a huge production of something called acetyl-CoA. Now, acetyl-CoA, right, this is kind of a precursor, right, if you will. You know, without acetyl-CoA, the TCA cycle cannot continue. One of the things that glucagon will do is it actually kicks from acetyl-CoA from the mitochondria of the cell and ejects it out of the mitochondria, eventually turning that acetyl-CoA into a fatty acid. Right? Again, that process of the production of acetyl-CoA, we haven't talked about that yet, but think of it this way, right? This glucose molecule, right, undergoes the production where eventually it's going to become, where's my cursor? There we go. Where it's eventually going to become ATP. On that road of ATP production, it becomes, there's a production of a few different proteins. Pyruvate's one of them. Acetyl-CoA is another molecule which is produced, right? These are molecules which are necessary to generate more and more ATP. They initially came from glucose. So if I want to elevate blood glucose levels, I don't want to continue to produce ATP, right? I don't want to continue to produce ATP at elevated levels. Right, so therefore, glucagon can stimulate the conversion of acetyl-CoA from the mitochondria, kicks it out, and eventually that acetyl-CoA gets converted into a fatty acid. That exact pathway we're going to look at in probably next week, next week or the week thereafter. Right, when we look at metabolism and the digestion, metabolism, and nutrition, when we look at those particular chapters. Now, a couple of things when I talk about, if we don't want ATP produced, one of the things to kind of clarify is ATP is something that will always be produced in the body. No ands, ifs, buts about it, right? Your body, your mitochondria, even the cells of your body will produce astronomical amounts of ATP. I'm talking trillions of these things on a daily basis, right? It produces huge numbers of these things. So it's always going to produce massive quantities of ATP. Things like glucagon, things like insulin can simply turn it up and turn it down. It's never like they completely inactivate or they completely stop the production of ATP. Right, so a moment ago when I said, if we want to elevate blood glucose, glucose levels, we no longer want to convert that glucose into pyruvate and into acetyl-CoA. It's not like we halt the production of ATP. We just simply slow it down a little bit, right? Instead of being in 5th gear, we slow it down to 4th gear, if that makes sense. Right, again, that's glucagon. Glucagon, just like insulin, that is also released from the pancreas. Other hormones, right? They're definitely a little less understood. They're understood, but nowhere near the extent of insulin and glucagon. Something called somatostatin and something called pancreatic polypeptide. Right, somatostatin, you can see that's released from the pancreas. It's also released from the hypothalamus. Somatostatin is something that can also be, or is also called growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Right, so it actually inhibits the release of growth hormone, and you can see somatostatin actually inhibits the release of a number of different hormones, right? Insulin, glucagon, growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and the majority of GI related hormones that we've talked about, where it reduces or it decreases GI function. Same idea with pancreatic polypeptide, right, shortly after eating, helps reduce gastric motility and as well as inhibits pancreatic digestive secretions. Right, the idea is pancreatic polypeptide helps to promote satiety, or it may helps you feel satiated, helps you feel full. Right, there's something else released from adipose cells or adipocytes, right, or fat cells, something called leptin. That's a hormone which is also related to the feeling of satiety and feeling full. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. I think we'll get to it today. I think so. Another gland, right, is something called the pineal gland. Right, we can see the pineal gland secretes melatonin. We talked about this when we covered the nervous system, but we'll talk about it again here. We can see light prevents its release. Yeah, when we, in the presence of light, right, melatonin is not secreted at any appreciable levels. Right, that's why I can sleeping kind of in a dark room. Right, if you've ever noticed, oh man, when I sleep with a light on, I just don't feel quite as well rested. It's one of the things with melatonin is it's kind of been looked at a little bit backwards. Whereas, oh man, melatonin is what makes you sleepy. Yeah, as we kind of understand it a little bit more so, it's not so much that melatonin makes you sleepy. It's that kind of as you are starting to wind down, as you're producing more, getting more into the sleep phase, that's when melatonin is begun to be released in sizable quantities. We can see it regulates circadian rhythm. So it's not just so much your sleep-wake cycle, like, oh, it puts you to bed and it wakes you up in the morning. It's not so much that. When we talk about circadian rhythm, right, there are certain hormones, cortisol, for instance, which is released on a cyclic basis. Right, other hormones, right, FSH, LH, they're released on a cyclic basis. Well, how is it that our body knows where the heck we are in the cycle? Right, cortisol is always highest. Cortisol levels in the blood are always highest somewhere right around 8 a.m. How does our body know it's 8 a.m. in the morning? I'm not sure why I said 8 a.m. in the morning. It was kind of redundant there, so I could have just said 8 in the morning or 8 a.m. and left it good. But it's the release or the levels of melatonin which allow the body to know where in this cycle we are. Right? I think I mentioned this before. Right? We're not this sensitive. However, there are some animals, right, which their reproductive cycles are entirely based upon melatonin. Right? Because of the fact that their reproduction coincides with melatonin levels. Right? Certain animals, deer, for instance, right, they don't want to have offspring like at the beginning of winter. Right, because the odds of that offspring surviving that cold, harsh winter is pretty slim. So that's where literally the ability of that animal to get pregnant coincides with melatonin. Again, we're not that sensitive, right? We can get, well, not we, I can't, but women can, pregnant, throughout the year, not just specific times of the year. Now, another hormone or another gland that produces hormones, the thymus gland. Now, one thing about the thymus gland, right? This image up here in the top right, this is a pretty sizable thymus, right? The thymus, as we age, gets smaller and smaller. When I say age, I don't mean like in our 60s and 70s. I mean when we are a fetus, when we are an infant, our thymus is gigantic. It is massively huge. And even as we age from infancy to adolescence to teenagehood to college age to adult, well, college age is adulthood, but you get my point, right? Your thymus gland gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, right? In 60s and 70s, it really becomes nothing more than just a fatty mass, right? There was the 18 cadavers are dissected in chiropractic school. Again, they were generally they were older, right? People in their 70s, 70 plus. Their thymus was nothing more than kind of like a fatty mass, right? It had just reduced in size so significantly much. But one of the things with the thymus, we see it's going to produce thymosins, right? We see this promotes maturation of certain lymphocytes in the immune system, specifically T cells or T lymphocytes. Remember, your T lymphocytes, they are responsible for cell-mediated immunity in our bone marrow. Right? Hemopoiesis, blood cell production. All blood cells are produced in the red bone marrow. Certain white blood cells remain in the bone marrow. They mature in the bone marrow, and they're called B lymphocytes or B cells. Right. Certain white blood cells leave the red bone marrow, travel to the thymus, and from there, in the presence of these thymosins, they are going to mature to become T lymphocytes. Again, those are your cell-mediated immune function or immune cells. We talk about cell-mediated as B cells and being antibody-mediated. Right, your B cells are what are going to produce the antibodies. Right, again, the immune system. We talked about that last semester in lymphatics. But this is where the certain parts of the immune system, specifically your T cells, this is where they actually matures, here in the thymus. A brief, right, Cliff Notes version of the reproductive organs, right, and the reason why is in about 6 weeks or so, we are going to, right, so, we are going to cover in depth the reproductive organs. So I'm just gonna, cover them kind of very briefly here. Gonads, right? Gonads are just a generic term, right? The gonads in females are ovaries. FSH, right? Follicle stimulating hormone is something that the gonads can produce. LH, right? Helps stimulate ovulation, right? Now, right? FSH, LH, right? Also being released from the pituitary gland, right? So the hypothalamus releases something called gonadotropin. Right, that gonadotropin then stimulates the release of FSH and LH, right? In the testes, right, FSH is going to stimulate the sperm production, whereas LH is going to stimulate testosterone production. And then lastly, prolactin, again, that's something produced in the anterior pituitary. That's going to cause the mammary glands to produce milk, right? Think of prolactin, produce milk. Again, they are much more involved with that, right? Much more involved with that. And we are going to cover them in much greater detail in about 6 or so weeks when we cover reproduction. But for right now, that's the depth that we're getting into because of the reproductive chapter. The kidneys, right? Your kidneys are another endocrine tissue, or they contain endocrine tissue. They get release something called EPO, something called erythropoietin, right? Erythropoietin. We see erythropoietin stimulates hematopoiesis. Right, remember this image we saw here, how I just mentioned. Yeah, in our red bone marrow, that's where blood cell production is going to occur. Well, if we specifically talk about red blood cells, right, hematored poiesis production, so the production of red blood cells in the red bone marrow. And this is in response to decreased oxygen levels. Yeah, we have not, you covered respiratory last semester of 121. Forgot the curriculum changing next semester. In 121, you covered respiratory system, but even if you hadn't, right, our red blood cells are what the oxygen in our body kind of piggybacks to. If you remember, there was a protein. There was something called hemoglobin. Right, hemoglobin was a protein that contained 4 iron ions. Right, the oxygen that we breathe into our lungs, that oxygen diffuses across the alveolar wall, and that oxygen binds to the iron. Then that red blood cell, which the hemoglobin and the iron are bound to, then travels from the lungs to whatever tissue of the body to drop off that oxygen. So if oxygen levels are low, right, if oxygen levels are low, we need to increase our ability to carry oxygen around the body. How do we do that? Well, that means we need to increase the amount of, or the number of red blood cells that are present in the blood. This is, again, think of actually the Olympics just getting postponed until 2021, right? Most Olympic training centers are at elevation, right? Why? Well, part of why that is the fact that when you train at elevation, there's a lesser concentration of oxygen in the air, or at least the pressure is reduced, so therefore there's not as much oxygen getting into the lungs. So one of the kind of changes that occur is oxygen levels begin to decrease. So our body has to respond, right? As our body, I just realized erythropoietin spelled incorrectly. For some reason, I decided to throw an extra H in there. I apologize. But as oxygen levels decrease, we need to increase the number of red blood cells which are present. So our kidneys will produce this EPO, or this erythropoietin. Right, so in athletes or anybody who trains at elevation, their body is going to create greater numbers of red blood cells. Right, blood doping, for instance. Right, blood doping is it's not increased levels of erythropoietin, but kind of sort of. Right, blood doping is where, right, let's say somebody who has some endurance event, right, Tour de France, whatever it happens to be, they can have the red blood cells in their blood pulled out. Well, if they've had the red blood cells pulled out, their body is going to respond, and their body, over just a course of a few days, is going to increase and normalize the number of red blood cells which are present. Shortly before the event, the race, whatever it happens to be, the athlete goes and can have those, the red blood cells which were removed injected back into the bloodstream. Now, if that happens, well, that means now they have greater numbers of red blood cells in the body, which means they can carry around greater levels of oxygen around the body. Oxygen, we all know we need oxygen, but why the hell do we actually need oxygen? Oxygen is a molecule which is absolutely necessary to produce the massive number of ATP that we need. So if I'm an athlete, and if I'm an endurance athlete, I need massive levels of oxygen to sustain myself for the event and for the race, right? It's not like blood doping. It's not something that's legal, right? I mean, any federation, any association, NCAA, whatever athletic association it is. I mean, blood doping is always illegal. It's always against the rules. It's not something that's just like steroids, for instance, right? So blood doping is definitely against the rules, but certain athletes still do it because it puts you at a tremendous advantage. Now, the next group of hormones, we can see they're all lipid or fatty acid based, right? These are eicosanoids. We see they are a major regulator of the inflammatory cascade. We see they're paracrine and autocrine in nature. If you think back to the very beginning of the first video that we covered, there was endocrine, neurocrine, paracrine, autocrine. We've been talking this whole time about endocrine, where the particular gland produces the hormone, and that hormone then gets dumped into the bloodstream. And then from the bloodstream, it travels from point A to point B. Paracrine and autocrine, these are where they stimulated either them, that hormone they release stimulated themselves or the neighboring cells, right? Because that's the thing with inflammation. We don't want this just entire systemic immune response. That's where we start to have allergies. That's where we start to, potentially have anaphylaxis, and that's a big problem. If you get stung by a bee on the back of the hand, the back of your hand, maybe the entire back of your hand, or the side, something the size of a $50 might turn red. It's a localized immune response, right? The venom of that bee is beginning to destroy the tissue in that particular area, right in the back of the hand where the sting is. So my body wants to mobilize white blood cells to that specific area to make sure that that damage is contained to that localized site where I got stung. If I'm allergic, for instance, if I'm really allergic to bees, or even if I'm minimally allergic to bees, I can start to have a systemic response to that allergen, meaning I start to have not just localized, but that response where blood vessels begin to dilate, where I start to have increased accumulation of mast cells, I start to have increased accumulation of white blood cells. That over long term, that with allergies, for instance, people starting to have anaphylaxis or people starting to have breathing problems, that has to do with the fact that, remember, in cardiovascular system, when blood rushes to an area, you sprain your ankle, for instance, right? What happens? It gets swollen. Why does it get swollen? Or swollen, however you want to pronounce it. right? When you have a great deal of damage, one of the things is a bunch of blood flows to that area. Why? Because blood flowing to the area brings a bunch of white blood cells, a bunch of reparative cells, and that entire cascade ensues. Well, if more blood flows to it, more blood, well, not more blood, more fluid can leak out of the vessel and into the tissue, and it starts to swell. That's fine and dandy if it happens into, surrounding the ankle. The ankle can swell to the size of a football. It's just skin. It'll stretch. In the lungs, that sounds like a hell of a problem, right? If I all of a sudden start to have increased levels of blood flowing to different, tissues of the lung because of the mast cells or the basal cells releasing histamine, that starts to create a problem. I start to have increased fluid accumulation surrounding the lungs, and now I start to have breathing problems, right? That is problematic. But when we look at these, right, different types of eicosanoids, we see prostaglandins, thromboxanes, leukotrienes, right? We can see, right, leukotrienes, allergy, inflammation, gastric damage, right? Leukotrienes, or if you've ever seen something, a LOX or a COX-1 or a COX-2 inhibitor, or thromboxanes or prostacyclines. There's a number of different medications and even over-the-counter stuff where it will begin to impact kind of inflammation, right? When we think about like aspirin, Tylenol, we're not so much sure, but ibuprofen, right? When we start to look at how these anti-inflammatory medicines work, they have to do with, right, depending on what type of medication they are, they have some sort of impact somewhere in this cascade, right? Whether they impact the production of phospholipase A, whether they block the production of COX-1 or COX-2 inhibitors, right? The Celebrex, right, is a COX, I forget which one, but a COX inhibitor. So if it inhibits the production of COX, therefore that means it prevents the production of prostacyclines, prostaglandins, and thromboxanes, which if those are blocked, that means it helps to reduce inflammation and it reduces pain. The problem with that, though, is thromboxanes help to lead to the production of clots and hemostasis, or the clotting of blood. So that's why, right, some of these anti-inflammatories lead to elevated rates of bleeding, because it's not just a matter of, hey, awesome, they reduce inflammation, they reduce pain. Inflammation is something that is absolutely 100% necessary. And it kind of goes in the same token that I had mentioned before, where a piece of chocolate cake is a good thing. A whole chocolate cake is a bad thing, right? Same idea here. Inflammation is a very good thing. It is very beneficial. It is very necessary. A lot of inflammation, that's a bad thing, right? A lot of inflammation, that's where we start to have significant systemic impacts or problems. Now, the stress response, right, we talk about eustress, distress. Eustress is just something that helps kind of reduce, right? It's something that kind of helps us, get through stress, something that kind of prepares us for the stress, kind of makes us stronger, if that makes sense. I'm not going to talk about eustress very much, but distress, right? Anything that actually harms the body, right? For instance, the first stage, right? Something called fight or flight. That's just going to jump to the next image here because that's what I want to get to. We talk about the stress response. Now, acute stress. I talked about this a little bit when we covered the adrenal gland. But the stress response, right? Acute, short-term stress, right? Our stress, or kind of our stress response, that is something that is meant to get us out of harm's way, right? For instance, elevated heart rate, elevated breathing rate, right? When we're running from something, or where we have this super high sympathetic elevation, that means we are, generally supposed to be running from some, right, potentially catastrophic event, getting mauled by a bear, right, falling into something detrimental to our health. Right, we didn't, the stress that we exhibit, or that we experience nowadays from, oh my God, whatever social media post or whatever it happens to be, that's way different than the stress that we have dealt with for thousands upon thousands of years. Right, so stress is meant to be short term, or at least the response to the stress is meant to be short term. Right now we can see, right, the green response here. Right, this is like the acute short-term stress. This is kind of the normal course of things, how it's supposed to occur. Again, via the hypothalamus, we see the sympathetic centers of the spinal cord. That's going to increase the release of epinephrine. That's going to then cause, for instance, increased heart rate, the constriction of blood vessels, dilation of blood vessels to the heart, to the lungs, to the skeletal muscle. We're going to increase levels of ATP production. We're going to increase sympathetic tone. All of these things are going to be elevated in kind of those short-term acute stress situations. Over the long term, right, stress is not something that is a good thing to be experiencing, right? And the reasons as to why that is because of the hormones that actually get released. It's not so much that epinephrine is just released in continuous quantities. It's not so much that, but thyroid stimulating hormone, human growth hormone, and adrenocorticotropic hormone begin to be released in elevated levels, much more elevated than they're supposed to be. And the reason why that's problematic, right? Cortisol stimulates lipolysis, which lipo, fat, lysis, breakdown. Hey, the breakdown of fat, that sounds like a good thing. When that happens, glucose levels elevate. All right, cool. Well, elevated levels of growth hormone also stimulates lipolysis. Awesome. Stimulate lipolysis, break down more fat, I'm going to burn more fat. Awesome. The issue with that, right? Even gluconeogenesis also, is stimulated from cortisol. The problem with that is if we break down fats and if we release more fatty acids into the blood, if we release more glucose into the blood, that sounds great. I just burned a bunch of fats, but the problem is if I just dumped a bunch of glucose into the blood, what if I didn't need all of that additional glucose? If I didn't need all of that additional glucose, what hormone is then going to elevate? Well, what hormone elevates in the presence of high blood glucose? Insulin. So insulin levels are going to elevate, right? So insulin levels are going to stimulate lipogenesis, which is going to cause the generation of fat, right? When we begin to generate that fat, glucose levels then begin to normalize. But you can see where stress, right, how I mentioned before, right, we're going back to the endocrine, the first video where we talked about receptors and sensitivity and upregulation and downregulation. How I mentioned when we eat, high glycemic index foods, if insulin levels are elevated, that begins to downregulate these receptors over the period of, years. Eventually, those receptors become resistant. And that's just the food that you consume. If we're stressed on a daily basis as well, just explain to you how stress, how elevated cortisol can elevate glucose levels, which in turn will also elevate insulin levels. So it's not just your food which can lead to elevated insulin levels. It's also being stressed. So again, do some yoga, do some meditation, go golf. Right now you can't go golf. I guess out in your backyard, do some yoga online. You got nothing but time right now. We're all in the house. We can't go anywhere. Ridiculous. Anyways, not ridiculous, necessary. But right, do some things to kind of reduce your stress level, especially in times like this with all the things that are going on. Read a book, right? I don't read. I should. I read. It's Hungry Caterpillar. Whatever my kids are into. Not so much my 7-year-olds. They are way beyond Hungry Caterpillar. They're into Nancy Drew, which I don't really know what that is. Anyways, moving on. Aging, right? Aging, endocrine system. Aging brings about changes, right? Some increase while some decrease. Things like epinephrine, norepinephrine remain the same. Yeah, there's a number of different hormones that there are some hormones which do increase a little bit, right? TSH, that increases a little bit as we age, but for the most part, they're going to reduce, right? Especially, the digestive hormones or the digestive related hormones. They're all going to reduce as we age, right? As we age, Many of these hormones are released in response to the stretching of the stomach or the stretching of the intestines. These stretch receptors get worn out as we age. By the age of 60, Lord, couldn't even fathom a guess as to how many times you've eaten of food. So let me just think of the number of times these stretch receptors have stretched out. So they become less sensitive. The fact that they become less sensitive, that means they produce less hormone. The receptors themselves, right? If you remember one of the uh, one of the impacts of how much hormone was released is the sensitivity of the receptor. Now, as we age, these receptors get worn out as well, so therefore they become that much less sensitive to the hormone, and they release that much less of their hormone. So again, all these things begin to reduce as we age, right? And some of the kind of the issues, the problems that can develop, right, as well, depending on what hormone it happens to be, right? Something called gigantism, right? Pituitary gigantism. We see these are produced by excess secretion of growth hormone. But gigantism, this is when we're younger in life. Actually, I'll just go to a picture here. You can see on the top left here. Again, this is a normally, height individual. Obviously, here is a little bit taller. You can see they're identical twins, but, this guy looks like way taller than that dude, right? And why is that? Right. When I say that pituitary gigantism, right, occurs in adolescence, the reason why I specify adolescence is because of the fact that in order to grow in height, your growth plates have to be open, right? If you think way back to chapter 6, right, your growth plates or your epiphyseal plates, they had to be open, right? That's the only way the bone is going to be able to elongate. So if you have pituitary gigantism, that means you had elevated secretion of growth hormone in adolescence when those growth hormones were still actually open, right? Later on in life, right? Let's say I'm an adult, right? Physically, mentally, mentally I'm still not a child, but that's okay. I can live with it. But later on, right, when we're physically an adult, right, after our growth plates have closed or after our epiphyseal plates have closed, right, the bone can no longer lengthen, but the bone can still thicken, right, and that's what actually happens. That's something called acromegaly, right? You can see this gentleman here, right, smack dab in the middle, right, kind of has a very kind of protrusive eyebrow, right, kind of a brow ridge, right? His mandible is kind of very kind of square-like. Kind of going back, if you Jaws from James Bond back in like the 70s, which, okay, I'm going back, and I'll refer to Happy Gilmore, which was, I think, 95, Mr. Johnson, I believe, the construction worker who shot himself in the head with a nail. If you saw that movie, it's a great movie, I highly recommend it. He had acromegaly, and when you saw him, you would know exactly what I'm talking about. When you looked at him, his eyes were very sunken in. His brow ridge was very protrusive. His same thing with his mandible, it was kind of very square. His cheekbones, his zygomas were just very large, right? And that's where, right, and that's the reason why, is because he had acromegaly, right? A number of these people actually succumb to like cardiac issues because think about it, the bones just continuously thicken. So the sternum, the ribs, all, the vertebrae, everything just continuously thickens. The bone continuously grows. So bone is very vascular, so it's a couple of different issues. One, there's that much more blood supply that the heart has to pump through. So therefore it puts a much, much greater demand on the heart. And that just becomes restrictive because of the thickness of the ribs and the sternum. So here, top right, as far as enlargement of the thyroid. Right. One of the things which is necessary for proper thyroid function is iodine. Right. That's why if you look at the salt supply in or around the globe, right, if you look at salt supply at the store, you see iodized and then non-iodized. Right. Salt in and of itself does not contain iodine. So therefore, if they add iodine to it, that's where it then becomes iodized salt. Iodine is in it's in shellfish, right? Those sorts of things, foods that we generally don't consume in very sizable quantities in this country. So that's the reason why it's simply added to the salt supply. Right. Cushing's, right? See the bottom right, kind of has this kind of like kind of this moon face. He's just kind of round. I mean, you just kind of moon face. It literally almost kind of looks round like a moon. Also something called, they call it a buffalo hump, like this very large kind of hump, almost like, not to poke fun, but almost kind of like this Quasimodo-ish hump, right, where there's accumulation of adipose tissue, right? We see this as the release of excess glucocorticoid, or most specifically, excess cortisol release, right? And that's something called Cushing's syndrome. So again, these are just kind of some of the endocrine disorders which can arise, that we're going to talk about. Next, we're going to get into looking at the next image on next class. The PowerPoints will be up. We're going to start to get into digestion and metabolism, right? And so the previous video, again, that was the first half of the endocrine system, and here is the second portion of that.